Hi, I'm Yelena, and in this video, I'll walk you through the step-by-step process of sewing the Nina tote bag. It's a stylish quilted tote that's perfect for everyday use, and beginner-friendly too. You'll find the printable pattern in the description below, available in my Etsy shop. Before we jump in, make sure to download and print the pattern. All important details are included in the guide. So let's get started. After downloading the pattern, print it at 100% scale. Don't resize it. Double-check the test square on the first page to make sure your printer settings are correct. The pattern includes outer borders. Cut along those lines and match the diamond-shaped markers to align the pages properly. Once you've assembled and cut out the pieces, you'll notice that each one is labeled with the fabric type, how many to cut, and the grain line direction. Make sure to follow the grain line. It really matters for how your bag turns out. I've already cut out all the pieces to save time in the video. Let me quickly show you the materials I'll be using. For the batting, I'm using a universal type. All of its properties are listed in the pattern guide and also in the Etsy listing under materials needed. For the outer fabric, I'll be using a medium weight cotton, one solid and one printed. The lining is made from a lightweight cotton fabric. And for the straps, I'm using grosgrain ribbon in a color that matches one of the main fabrics. You can also use a contrasting color if you like. We'll also need one swivel hook and matching threads. Now let's start by preparing the small pieces. First, we need to mark the center line along the length of each strap. You can use tailor's chalk or a disappearing fabric marker, but I prefer simply folding the strap in half and pressing it gently with my fingers to create a visible crease. That crease will serve as our guide. Next, fold one long edge toward the crease and press it with steam. Then fold the other side in the same way and press again. Continue this process along the full length of the strap. Here's what the finished piece should look like. Repeat the same steps to prepare both straps. Lay the folded strap piece flat and place the grosgrain ribbon on top, right side facing up. Align the ribbon along the center of the strap, covering the seam line. Make sure there's equal space on both sides. Pin the ribbon in place from one end to the other. Let's attach the ribbon to the strap. Start by sewing along one edge of the grosgrain ribbon, about 2 millimeters or 1/16 of an inch from the edge. Use a stitch length of 2.5 millimeters. Now move to the other side and do the same. Stitch along the edge, keeping the same distance and stitch length. This secures the ribbon neatly in place and gives the strap a professional look. Once both seams are done, press the strap with steam to set the stitches and flatten the layers. This step really helps the strap keep its shape. Here's how it should look when you're done. Clean, crisp, and ready for the next step. Now let's prepare the exterior pocket. I'm placing the lining piece right sides together with the outer pocket piece, aligning the top edge. That means the right side of the lining faces the right side of the exterior fabric. I pin the pieces together to keep everything in place. And now we're ready to sew along the top edge. Now sew along the pinned edge using a 1 centimeter seam allowance. That's about 3/8 of an inch. Make sure to backstitch at the beginning and end to secure the seam. I'm using a stitch length of 2.5 millimeters. Once the seam is done, here's what it should look like. Now press the seam flat to set the stitches. Then open it up and press the seam allowances to both sides. This gives the pocket a clean look and makes the next steps easier to handle. Next, fold the pocket piece along the notches. This will bring the bottom edge up to align with the lower edge of the lining. Make sure everything lines up neatly, then press the fold to hold it in place. Now, top stitch along the right side of the pocket 2 centimeters, or about 3/4 of an inch, from the edge. I'm using a 3.5mm stitch length here, but feel free to go up to 5mm for a more decorative finish. Once the stitching is done, press the seam with steam to flatten everything and set the shape. Now let's prepare the interior pocket. At the top edge, you'll notice 2 small notches. These show us exactly where to fold. Fold the top edge down, using those notches as your guide, and press well to hold the crease. Next, take the raw edge and gently fold it inward, right into the crease we made earlier. Then press it flat with steam so it holds its shape. Now top stitch from the right side to secure the fold. I'm stitching about 1.8 to 2 centimeters. That's around 3/4 of an inch from the folded edge. Use a stitch length of 2.5mm. Since this line will be visible, take your time and keep it neat and even. Now we need to fold and press the bottom and both side edges of the pocket, turning them in 1 centimeter. That's about 3/8 of an inch. If you're a beginner, here's a helpful tip. Draw a line parallel to the raw edge at twice the distance. That's about 2 centimeters or 3/4 of an inch. Then fold the edge over to meet the line and press. Now we'll do the same thing with the side edges. Fold them in by 1 centimeter or about 3/8 of an inch and press with steam. You can use the same tip as before. Draw a line with a fabric pen or chalk to help guide your fold. Once both sides are pressed, your pocket piece is fully prepped and ready for the next step. Now we'll prep the key leash. Fold the piece in half lengthwise, wrong sides together, and press it well with steam to create a center crease. This crease will help us fold the raw edges inward in the next step. Now unfold the strip and take each raw edge, folding it inward toward the center crease. The edges should meet neatly in the middle without overlapping. Once everything is aligned, press the entire strip flat with steam. This will give you a clean, double-folded strap, ready for top stitching. Now, stitch along both long edges of the folded strip, about 1 to 2 millimeters. That's roughly 1/16 of an inch from the edge. Use a stitch length of 2.5 millimeters. This secures the folds and gives the key leash a nice, clean finish. Slide the swivel hook onto the strap. Then fold one end of the strap up by about 2.5 centimeters. That's 1 inch. Now it's time to secure the swivel hook in place. Set your stitch length to 2 millimeters for this step and use a zipper foot for better access. I like to start stitching from the center of the strap. First, I sew forward through the thickest part, then stitch all the way back to the other side and finally forward again, ending where I started. I also add a small back stitch at the end to lock everything in place. This method helps prevent shifting and gives you a clean, secure finish, especially when working over bulky layers like this folded edge. Let's finish the key leash by tucking in the short raw edge, then sew another line of stitching close to the edge, just like before. Starting from the center, stitching forward, then back, and finishing with a small back stitch. This helps secure everything firmly in place. Keep your stitch length at 2 millimeters, and you can use a regular presser foot here. If you find it tricky to stitch over the thick fold, try using a hump jumper tool to level out the foot pressure. I'll show a quick insert on screen so you can see what it looks like. And that's the finished look for this step. Now let's mark our first quilting guidelines. Using a quilting ruler, draw 2 lines that intersect at a right angle, but position them at a 45-degree angle to the fabric edges. These will serve as your starting guide for quilting. Now let's position the fabric for quilting. Place the upper exterior piece right side up on top of the batting. Make sure the fabric is centered, with even space on the left and right sides. At the top, leave a small gap, about 2 to 3 centimeters, or roughly 1 inch. This ensures we have enough batting below to attach the second exterior piece later. Once aligned, Pin the fabric in place to prevent shifting while quilting. Let's start the quilting by stitching along the 2 marked lines. These lines will define the direction for the rest of the quilting. I'm using the longest stitch length on my machine. In my case, that's 5 millimeters. Now let's finish the quilting. Using the 2 stitch lines as a guide, continue quilting in both directions, keeping the lines about 5 centimeters or 2 inches apart. You can draw your quilting lines ahead of time if that helps, or use a quilting guide like I'm showing in the video. Mine came with the machine as part of the standard accessories. Use the longest stitch length available, usually around 4 to 5 millimeters, for a clean and gentle texture. Once you're done, give the quilted piece a good press with steam to smooth everything out. Now let's move on to the exterior pocket. Take the finished pocket and line it up with the quilted main piece, using the center notches as your guide. Make sure everything is straight, then pin it in place. Now let's secure the exterior pocket in place. We're going to stitch along the bottom and both sides about 5 millimeters, that's roughly 3/16 of an inch, from the edge. This line not only holds the pocket in place for the next steps, but also adds strength for daily use. It helps prevent the pocket from shifting and ensures it stays secure even after repeated use. Use a stitch length of 2.5 millimeters and take your time to keep the stitching neat and consistent. Let's move on to placing the straps. I'm using the outer notches at the top and bottom as guides for alignment. Make sure that the inner edge of each strap overlaps the seam of the exterior pocket. This helps secure the pocket sides and adds durability to the bag. And if your straps seem a little longer than the main panel, that's totally fine. They have a 5/8 inch, or 1.5 centimeters, seam allowance, which gives you extra length. Next, measure 1.5 centimeters, or 5/8 of an inch, down from the top edge of the main panel and mark a straight guideline. Since the bottom ends of the straps are already pinned in place, we'll now focus on positioning the top ends. Align them with the outer notches and place them along your marked line. Make sure the straps slightly overlap the pocket seam, just like before. Then pin the top end securely in place to prepare for stitching. Now it's time to secure the straps in place. Stitch along the right side first, then across the bottom, and finally up the left side, keeping your stitches about 2 to 3 millimeters or around 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch from the edge. Use a 2.5 millimeter stitch length for this step. Make sure to leave the top edge of each strap open. We'll finish that part later. Don't forget to backstitch at the beginning and end. It's especially important in this step to keep everything secure. After stitching, give the straps a good press with steam so they hold their shape nicely. Here's what the finished strap should look like at this stage. Now let's attach the bottom part of the exterior panel. Place the bottom outer fabric piece right sides together with the quilted top section. Start by matching the center notches and pin them together first. This helps ensure your alignment is accurate. Then pin the rest of the edge, smoothing the fabric as you go. Now let's stitch the seam to connect the top and bottom exterior pieces. Sew with a 1 centimeter seam allowance, that's about 3/8 of an inch, using a 2.5 millimeter stitch length. Make sure to backstitch at the beginning and end of the seam to keep everything secure. Now let's reinforce the straps to make sure they're extra secure. Sew an extra line of stitching across each strap attachment point. You can either stitch over the same spot 2 or 3 times, or use a reinforced triple stitch, just like I'm doing here. This step is important to keep the straps strong and safe for everyday use. Press the seam flat to set the stitches. Then turn the bottom part of the outer panel right side out and press the seam again from the front side. Now we'll top stitch along the seam about 2 to 3 millimeters, or 1/16 of an inch, from the edge. I'm using a stitch length of 3.5 millimeters to give it a clean, finished look. And here's how the finished top stitching should look. Nice and even along the edge. Let's secure the bottom panel. Sew a line of stitching along the remaining 3 edges, about 3 to 5 millimeters, or 1/8 to 3/16 of an inch from the edge. Use a longer stitch length, between 3.5 and 5 millimeters. This keeps the outer fabric and the insulation in place and adds structure to the piece. After that, press it well with steam to flatten and set the seam. Now, carefully trim the excess batting along the entire edge of this exterior panel, keeping your scissors close to the fabric for a clean finish. Once that's done, go ahead and prepare the second exterior panel in the exact same way, just without the pocket. It's constructed the same, so the process will feel familiar and quick. Next, fold the straps and pin them in place to keep them from shifting or getting caught as we sew the pieces together. Make sure to do this on both exterior panels. Next, we're going to join the front and back panels. Place both exterior panels right sides together, aligning all edges. Start by matching the horizontal seam where the top and bottom pieces meet. This is the most visible part of the finished bag, so we want the seams to line up perfectly. I'm showing here how I insert the pin directly through the seam on one side and carefully check that it comes out right through the seam on the other side. If it's even slightly off, I remove the pin and try again. This step is worth the extra time to get it just right. Once the seams are aligned and pinned, continue pinning around the rest of the panel, along the sides and bottom edge. Take your time to ensure everything is smooth and evenly pinned. Proper alignment here will make your final stitching cleaner and more professional looking. Now let's stitch the main panels together. Using a 2.5 millimeter stitch length, sew along both sides and across the bottom with a 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Make sure to backstitch at the beginning and end of each seam to keep everything secure. As you sew, take extra care at the seam junctions we aligned in the previous step. When you reach the point where the top and bottom panels meet, carefully sew directly over the alignment pin without removing it. This helps keep the seam perfectly matched and prevents it from shifting, especially important if you want your finished bag to look clean and symmetrical. And don't forget, we're only sewing the sides and the bottom here. Leave the inner corners unsewn for now, as they'll be shaped later. Let's press the seams to set our stitches. Start by pressing along all 3 sewn edges with steam. Now we're going to open the seams and press them flat. I'm using a universal pressing block, but feel free to use any tool that helps. A tailor's ham, sleeve board, or even just the edge of your ironing board for the side seams. The bottom seam can be a bit harder to press on a flat surface, so using a curved pressing aid can make the job much easier. Take your time here and work slowly along each edge, pressing the seams open one by one. Once all the seams have been pressed open, it's time to work on the boxed corners. Start by opening up the corner, matching the side seam with the bottom seam. Just like we did earlier, we'll use a pin to help align the seams perfectly. Insert a pin through the seam on one side, making sure it comes out precisely in the center of the seam on the opposite side. This will ensure the seams align exactly where they meet. Keep the pin in place, and then add 2 more pins on each side to hold the layers securely. Repeat the same process for the second corner. Now let's stitch the boxed corners. Sew with a 1 centimeter seam allowance, that's about 3/8 of an inch, using a 2.5 millimeter stitch length. Take your time around the seam intersection, especially if you've placed a pin there for perfect alignment. And don't forget to backstitch at the beginning and end to secure your seam. Repeat the same process for the other corner. Now that the corner seams are stitched, let's give them a good press. Start by pressing the seam from the wrong side to flatten the fabric layers. Then turn the piece right side out and press again from the outside to shape the corners cleanly. Take your time here. Crisp, well-pressed seams will give the bag a professional finish. And here's how it should look when it's done. Let's move on to the lining. I'm starting by folding the printed pattern to help mark the placement for the interior pocket. I marked the top corners where the pocket should go, using the notches on the pattern as a guide. Once the marks are in place, I remove the pattern and position the finished pocket, aligning it carefully with the markings. At this stage, I also pay attention to the direction of the fabric print, so I slightly adjust the position of the pocket to better match the print alignment. This helps make sure the pocket looks centered and balanced visually. Then I pin the pocket in place to prepare it for stitching. I'll sew it down along 3 sides, starting with a top stitch close to the edge. Top stitch along the sides and bottom of the pocket, about 2 to 3 millimeters from the edge, or roughly 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch. I'm using a 2.5 millimeter stitch length here. Don't forget to backstitch at the beginning and end to lock the seam. This line helps secure the pocket and sets the base for extra reinforcement in the next step. Now I'm adding a second line of stitching to reinforce the pocket. I begin right where the previous seam starts, adding a backstitch at the top edge. Then I pivot and sew a parallel line about 1 centimeter. That's 3/8 of an inch from the edge. At the end, I pivot again and stitch across the top edge to secure the other side. Don't forget to backstitch at the beginning and end. Then give it a quick press with steam to flatten everything out. And the pocket is ready. Now place the facing piece right side together with the top edge of the lining. Start by matching the center notches. This helps keep everything aligned. Then pin the sides and continue pinning along the edge. To position the key leash, I first place the pattern piece for the top exterior panel over the lining to find where the strap will go. This helps me mark the correct placement. Then I insert the key leash between the facing and the lining, right sides together, and pin it in place. I'm placing it close to where the strap will be attached. Now the 3 layers are ready to be sewn together. Now let's stitch the lining and facing together along the top edge. Keep the lining on the bottom as you sew. Stitch with a 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Use a stitch length of 2.5 millimeters and don't forget to backstitch at the beginning and end to secure the seam. Let's reinforce the base of the key leash with a parallel stitch line. I'm using a triple stitch here, but if your machine doesn't have one, just stitch over the same area 2 or 3 times. Now give the seam a good press to flatten it. Then turn the facing upward and press along the seam again to set it in place. Now let's top stitch the seam we've just sewn. I'm using a stitch length of 3.5 millimeters. You can go up to 5 millimeters, but 3.5 gives a nice clean finish here. Top stitch from the right side, about 2 to 3 millimeters. That's roughly 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch, away from the fold. After that, give the seam a quick press with steam to help it lay flat. And here's what the finished top stitching should look like. Make sure to repeat this step for the second lining panel. Just skip the key leash in the interior pocket on that side. Let's move on to assembling the lining. Place both lining pieces right sides together and take a moment to match the seams where the facing meets the main lining. This step is important for getting a clean, professional finish. Just like we did before, insert a pin directly through the seam on one side and make sure it exits through the seam on the opposite side. That way, everything stays perfectly aligned when we sew. Once that's in place, continue pinning down the side seam and across the bottom edge. On the other side, we'll need to leave a turning gap, so grab the printed pattern and use it to mark where that opening should go. Pin both ends of the gap and leave that section unpinned for now. We'll come back to it after assembling the rest. Now let's sew the lining pieces together. Start with the side that has the turning gap. Stitch from the top down to your first turning mark, backstitching at the beginning and end. Then skip the opening and continue stitching from the second mark down to the bottom corner, again securing the seam with back stitches. Sew the bottom edge next, just a straight line with a backstitch at both ends. For the other side, simply stitch from top to bottom in one go, making sure to keep your stitch line straight and even. We're using a 2.5 millimeter stitch length throughout this step. Now that the lining has been stitched, it's time to press and open the seams. Start by pressing over the entire piece to set the stitches and flatten the fabric. Next, open one stitched end and press the seam allowance open. I'm using a tailor's ham with a narrow collar edge. It helps open the seams cleanly, especially in tight areas. You can also use a pressing roll or a seam cushion. Both work well for pressing seams open. Take your time and repeat the process along the entire seam. All remaining seams should be pressed open the same way. Just like we did before with the exterior, now it's time to box the corners of the lining. Open up the unsewn corners and match the side seam with the bottom seam. Insert a pin straight through the seam line on one side and make sure it comes out through the exact seam on the other side. This helps align everything perfectly. Once the seams are aligned, leave that pin in place and add 2 more pins on either side to hold the layers securely. Repeat the same process for the second corner. Now let's stitch the boxed corners to shape the base of the lining. Sew along each corner seam using a 2.5mm stitch length, 1 centimeter or 3/8 inch from the edge. Be extra careful at the seam intersections where we previously inserted a pin for perfect alignment. Let's press the boxed corner seams, just like we did before. Start by pressing the seam from the wrong side to set the stitches. Then turn the piece right side out and press again. And here's what the result should look like. Now let's join the exterior and lining pieces together. First, I make sure that the straps are still pinned in place, as we did earlier. Then I grab the completed lining piece and align it so that the interior pocket will be positioned directly opposite the exterior pocket when the bag is finished. To do this, I place the exterior piece inside the lining with right sides together. Next, I match and pin the side seams. As before, I insert a pin directly into the seam on one side and make sure it comes out through the seam on the other side for perfect alignment. Then I align and pin the center notches. Once the main alignment points are secure, I continue pinning around the entire top edge to prepare for stitching. Now it's ready to sew around the top edge in the next step. Now let's stitch along the top edge of the bag. Sew all the way around with a 1 centimeter or 3/8 inch seam allowance using a 2.5mm stitch length. Take extra care when sewing over the strap attachment points. They can be bulky, so go slowly to keep your stitching neat and secure. Once you've stitched the full top edge, it's time to press the seam. To show this step clearly on camera, I'm using a small seam pressing pillow. It's not required. You can easily press this area using the narrow end of your ironing board. Use steam to flatten the seam and help it hold its shape. Now it's time to turn the bag right side out through the opening in the lining. Next, unpin the straps if you haven't already, and make sure everything is laying flat and aligned. Once the bag is fully turned, gently smooth out the top seam with your fingers to bring out the shape. I'm using a small pressing pillow again here to help with filming, but this step can be done just as easily on the edge of a regular ironing board. Give the entire top edge a good press with steam. This helps flatten the seam and sets the final shape of the bag. Now it's time to top stitch along the upper edge of the bag to secure the straps and finish the top neatly. You can use a single thread color for the entire top stitching, or you can do what I'm doing, using 2 different threads. I personally don't like how the visible line of stitching looks in my case, so I'm switching it up. First, I top stitch with white thread along the main top edge of the bag, between the straps. I'm sewing 1 centimeter, or 3/8 inch, from the edge using a 3.5mm stitch length, and don't forget to backstitch at the beginning and end. Then I switch to a reinforced triple stitch to go over the straps. I do this section with a matching thread and stitch back and forth to secure it strongly. This is the kind of finish I really like. Neat, strong, and visually clean. Finally, I give the seam a quick press. I'm using a pressing block here for better filming, but you can absolutely do this step on your ironing board. Only one final step left. To finish the bag, we need to close the opening in the lining. I begin by aligning the edges of the gap and securing them with pins. You can close this opening by hand using an invisible ladder stitch. If you're unfamiliar with this method, you can watch a full demonstration in my lily bag tutorial. The link is in the description. In this video, I'll simply sew it closed using a straight stitch on my sewing machine. I'm stitching 2 millimeters from the edge with a 2.5 millimeter stitch length, adding a back stitch at the beginning and end to secure the seam. Here's what the finished result looks like. Clean and secure. Before this step, you also have the option to anchor the side seams of the lining to the exterior at the base of the bag. This helps keep the lining in place. I demonstrate this helpful trick in the lily bag tutorial as well, so be sure to check the link in the description if you're curious. Thanks so much for watching and sewing with me. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you have any questions or thoughts, feel free to leave them in the comments. I read every single one.